Hello, my name is Edward Cullen, and I'll be joined by Kelly Riano and Crystal Maldonado. We will be discussing the issue of human rights in Latin America. Human rights has been a major issue throughout the history of Latin America, more so in recent years. The Cold War era brought the human rights issue to light with the repressive activities of the various military dictatorships. Argentina was foremost among them with its complex system of oppression that included its infamous policy of forced disappearances of its citizens. While democratization in the 1980s and 1990s brought an end to the organized oppressive military dictatorships, new challenges began to emerge with the exposure of police violence and corruption against the citizens of Latin American countries. Most notably, this is found in the current issues revolving modern Brazil and Venezuela. With this in mind, we ask ourselves, has the infringement of human rights advanced for citizens of Latin America following democratization? Basically, has human rights gotten better since the end of the military dictatorship? To clarify, we'll first establish that for the sake of our argument, we'll be using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights laid down in 1948 by the United Nations as our standard to view these case studies laid out before us, since the Declaration contains many key aspects for the discussion of human rights, including the universality of the security of an individual human, as well as the universality of a fair and open trial for every human, irregardless of almost anything, really. Our first case study will focus on the military regime in Argentina between 1976 and 1982. This period saw the failures of Juan Perón's brief return in 1972 erode support in the government to the point that certain elements saw the military to be the only way Argentina could stave off a full-blown left-wing revolution, which they feared was occurring at the time. The subsequent dirty war against the leftist urban guerrillas saw numerous human rights abuses come to light as the government broadened its fight against the guerrillas to include people that could be considered part of the guerrilla movement by association or subversive simply by their background. The point for the infamous disappearances especially, was that it gave the government a kind of legal cover to torture the disappeared before executing them, since technically you can't accuse the government of torturing a person if someone can't prove the government has taken them, basically. Babies of pregnant women who were kidnapped were also victims of this system of repression, as they were forced to give birth to the babies before the mothers were murdered, and the babies would then be put in homes, sometimes of the same people involved with the murder and kidnapping of their mothers. The end of the dictatorship has brought new discussions regarding human rights to the consciousness of the Argentinian people. One example of this movement is found in the Escrache movement in the 1990s, which sought to condemn members of the former dictatorship involved in the practice of disappearance and execution via shame tactics like protesting outside the residences of accused war criminals. This movement arose in the 1990s as family members considered the lack of jail sentences for those involved in the policies of repression were amnestied or simply not given sentences, a policy taken by the Menem presidency of the 1990s as a form of reconciliation. And they organized such groups as the Daughters and Sons for Identity and Justice Against Forgetting and Silence to bring attention to the issue. The new Argentinian democratic government did, however, see many resources be spent on investigating these crimes later on, and by setting up organizations to help with policies related to human rights, as well as to keep the documentation and other data from the military dictatorship for references for justice, like the documents for who was kidnapped, etc., etc. The amnesty laws previously implemented by the government were found to be later unconstitutional, citing legal quirks of putting individuals on trial for kidnapping the babies, but not for the war crime or crimes really of killing their parents, and that also put the laws of Argentina in violation of certain human rights laws, international human rights laws and treaties that Argentina was party to. The general census I took away from this research is that the issue of government oppression is definitely not to the point that it was in the military dictatorship. Like, you won't be able to form groups like those that went after, that protested in front of these individuals in the military dictatorship. That was something that they would no doubt put you um, in their harsh light. But there still is the issue of bringing the people to justice, which is a major component of human rights, to find justice for the individuals that suffered or had family members that were killed during the military dictatorship. So that's my takeaway from it, and I'll let Kelly Riano now go on to the current issue of police brutality and corruption in Brazil.
So, as we heard from Ed, we can see that corruption and police violence is prevalent in Argentina, but that is what interested us so much. The fact that such a frowned upon act was being accepted not only in one country, but multiple. In Brazil, this problem has been an issue since the return of democracy in 1985. The first article that I have found was actually interesting because it explains a study done on police killings and how they have not gone down but actually have increased since 1995. Two reasons of that would be mostly because of the social construct that Brazil has, as well as the deals, quote unquote, or understandings that right-wing politicians make with officers and law enforcement. The article titled Politics of Police Violence in Democratic Brazil explains the study from the text as follows. This study examines the rate of police killings in 19 Brazilian states from 1994 to 2001. In light of partisan electoral politics, the two major police forces in each state are the military and the civil police. Each has a different role. The military police are responsible for day-to-day policing of the streets and both preventing and repressing crime. Day-to-day police are the ones that suppress and hide most of what they do in order to keep it seeming as though there is no crime, or that if there is crime, it's just petty or small. But also because the majority of people that the police kill or abuse are too poor to even really make a difference, which means that if they're doing it in the smaller towns or the smaller favelas, then of course it's not going to be documented as fast or as easily as it would be if it was done in the bigger cities like Rio de Janeiro or something. It is safe to say that the only reason why police violence even escalated so much is because of the arrival of democracy in the first place. Teresa Caldera and James Holston from the University of California perfectly explain their evaluation when they say that this concurrence means that many such new democracies experience a similar and defining disjunction. Although their political institutions democratize with considerable success, and although they promulge constitutions and legal codes based on the rule of law and democratic values, the civil component of citizenship remains seriously impaired as citizens suffer systematic violations of their rights. So pretty much, in simple terms, it just means that even though there were pretty great reforms and laws put in place when democracy came, it was the law enforcement that took advantage of their job and abused their power with people who couldn't defend themselves, like I stated earlier, which brings about the question kind of a citizen's freedom of speech, which is something that our group wanted to emphasize as well. So, excuse me. Apart from the corruption and police violence, the one reason why not many people speak up, even if there's an abuse of power happening, it's because they're either in fear for their own safety or because they don't have the knowledge to know that it'd be considered abuse in the first place. So, for example, if here in the United States, a underprivileged kid gets frisked on the street just for being black, then he might not know that being frisked with no reason is illegal. Same case as in Brazil, where if you're in a poor country or in a favela in a smaller town where you don't have the education to know that um, police are actually mistreating you instead of helping you and saving you, then um, then you won't know that it's considered abuse in the first place. um, so because education is not all that common in Brazil, not many people know their civil rights, which means that they don't know that those rights are being taken advantage of. The other issue would be also the fact that there's no really concrete or obsolete um, definition of what your speech entails. So many of us think that our speech is the way that we talk or what we say, but in reality, that's just the umbrella that covers so much of our actions and what we post on our social media or um, posters or even the right to protest and stuff like that. Um, Not only is speech what comes out of your mouth or anything that I've stated, it's also your physical actions. Um, a quote taken from the text is, "In the case of any given freedom, there will always be room for unending disagreement over particular circumstantial restrictions. But the point being made here these is that these will be disagreements about the exercise of that freedom, not about the freedom itself. Confusion reigns as soon as we conflate the two." So, not is it not not only are we having a problem with what the freedom of speech entails, but more so what happens when that freedom gets taken advantage of. Brazil is not alone in having corruption being prevalent in their democracy, whether it's getting taken advantage of your rights or police violence being taken out of proportion. Um, and I think that's a great segue into my partner, Crystal, who's going to speak about the same things in Venezuela.
The case study of Venezuela is an integral current day example of the issues several states in Latin America experience concerning human rights. The issue of morality and justice for Venezuela has been an ongoing problem throughout several generations. The struggle for democracy through right and left wing parties has crumbled the economy and continues to negatively affect the gross domestic product. As a result, the government has violated civil liberties, created health disparities, and unlawfully convicted anyone and everyone who opposes the political agenda. These freedom riders or protesters are targeted by police and given unjust sentences through the court as an example to anyone who confronts or speaks out against legislation or executive ruling. This is far from democracy. This is creating a society that complies through fear and not freedom. The past actions of the late President Chavez and current actions of President Maduro represents a dictatorship that does not express justice, rights, liberty, or room to flourish. Instead, it represents a monarch-style politician that promotes anarchy through security forces and unlawfulness. We have a government that chastises its nationals and tourists for having a say in the condition of the country, which is hypocrisy at its finest. I'm going to attempt to address several issues that illuminate the chaos within the Venezuelan government that inadvertently and directly infringe on human rights and civil liberties. I would like to start by addressing the violence towards protesters and how security forces have oppressed and caused fatalities during peace rallies. Throughout the past few decades, the Venezuelan government has responded to massive anti-government protests with brutal force. Recently, security forces systematically create an atmosphere that promotes violence against unarmed protesters and bystanders. The government tolerates and oftentimes collaborates directly with armed pro-government gangs to attack protesters and also providing them with impunity. Detainees are often held on military bases before being presented to a judge, and in some cases suffer a range of abuses while in detention, such as severe beatings, electric shocks or burns, and being forced to squat or kneel without moving for hours. In addition to these unjust actions against peaceful protesters, President Maduro orders security forces nationwide to address security issues. However, these operations have led to detentions under false pretenses and even illegal home searches. Numerous killings have occurred during these operations, and excessive penalizations have been given as well. The idea of harsh sentences is nothing more than another form of oppression and directly violates social justice Venezuela. Venezuela conducts itself under sovereignty, and with this type of executive power being practiced, the justice system lacks independence to arrest and prosecute notable political contestants. Furthermore, the government has expanded and abused its powers to regulate media and has taken aggressive steps to reduce the availability of media outlets that engage in critical programming. While criticism of the government is articulated in some newspapers and on some websites and radio stations, fear of government reprisals has made self-censorship a serious problem. In 2010, the National Assembly amended the telecommunications law to grant the government power to suspend or revoke concessions to private outlets if it is convenient for the interests of the nation. It also expanded the scope of a restrictive broadcasting statute to cover the internet, allowing the arbitrary suspension of websites for the vaguely defined offense of incitement. Previous amendments to the criminal code and expanded the scope and severity of defamation laws that criminalize disrespect of high government officials. Those who create parties to speak out on what is unjust, known as the human rights defenders, are in the crosshairs of armed forces and faulty politicians. Venezuela's government has sought to marginalize the country's human rights defenders through repeated, unsubstantiated allegations that they are seeking to undermine Venezuelan democracy. During his weekly show on state-run television in 2015, member of the National Assembly and Armed Forces, politician Diosdado Cabello, repeatedly characterized human rights groups' participation in hearings as attempts to destabilize the government. Of course, with the idea of criminalization follows prison conditions. Corruption, weak security, deteriorating infrastructure, overcrowding, insufficient staffing, and poorly trained guards allow armed gangs to effectively control the prisons in which they are incarcerated in. The government has failed to ensure that basic medicines and supplies are available and accessible to all Venezuelans without discrimination. It has failed to provide the public health care system with medicines and supplies, and at the same time, its currency exchange rules and price controls interfere with the import of medicines and healthcare products, resulting in a grossly inadequate supply of essential medications and medical supplies. So in conclusion, the theme of false allegations, freedom of speech, and the excessive force of violence has created the Venezuelan government to follow a format that oppresses citizens by force and stripping the idea of choice. Human rights are not promoted. They are given when executive entities feel fit and taken when there is opposition to current rulings. This is the opposite of democracy. This is nothing more than authoritarianism exercised through tyranny.
I began talking about the legacy of human rights repression during the years of military dictatorship and the struggle for justice that Argentina faces today. Kelly focused on the corruption and police abuse that is rampant in modern Brazil. Finally, Crystal talked about the current issues of human rights abuses that are part of the ongoing protests against the government. In this video, we showed how human rights still remains a major issue in Latin American countries and something that they struggle to overcome. While these violations do not reach what they did during the peak of the military dictatorships in the 70s, 60s, and 80s, the issue of police violence, corruption, and accountability for dictatorship-era crimes still remains a major factor in understanding the current trends of human rights in Latin America.